Hello and welcome to the Dire Gentleman channel. My name is Gus Zagarella.
And I'm Henry Galley, and this is our show, Two Professional Writers, where Gus and I, a pair of guys who write and get paid for it for a living, talk about writing and life advice.
We have gone through a wide variety of people, from advice that is posted on Twitter, to advice that is in books, to advice that is in weird, obscure interviews with one of the richest men in the world. And now finally, we've come back to Twitter, but not in the way you'd expect.
Yeah, this is an interesting return to form for us. I know that technically the last one we did was Alan Moore, but spiritually I think we're still recovering from the 7-hour Chuck Wendig video.
I don't know if I will ever recover, Henry Galley. I don't know if I will ever be able to recover from 7 hours of Chuck Wendig writing advice.
So what are we talking about today, Gus?
So we are talking about the Pixar 22 Rules of Storytelling, which were originally tweeted by a story artist from Pixar known as Emma Coates.
So just to clarify, these are kind of like informal, codes that they live by, rather than something carved into a pair of stone tablets in the CEO's office, right?
As I always say, there is no stone. And also, you are correct, Henry. These are guidelines, essentially, that Pixar, as a studio, very prolific, has done, a number of stories. They're all about, empathizing with everything from our own emotions to inanimate objects to everything in between. And these are here to help guide them and help guide you out there if you want to tell a story similar to Pixar.
And also, if you want to tell a story that isn't similar to Pixar, we always say on this channel that you gotta Austin Kleon style, steal like an artist, take something, make it work for you. Because at the end of the day, it's all about how you choose to execute a thing.
Exactly. And if you're one of those types who's wants to break all the rules, here are Pixar's rules so you can know them, so you'll know why you're breaking them.
Alright, getting right into it. What is rule number 1, Gus?
Rule number 1 is you admire a character for trying more than for their successes.
This is a personal thing, but this is legitimately one of my favorite pieces of writing advice of all time. It is so true.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that because, when a character is striving, when a character is struggling towards their want or towards their need or towards figuring out that their want and need are different things, when they are, going for it, that's when we, really care. When they succeed, usually the story's over.
Do you know what I think is one of my favorite examples of this? One of the most, iconic and beloved movies of all time, and one of my mum's favorite, the original Rocky film. A lot of people forget he doesn't even win in that.
That's incredibly true.
It's just about going the distance. It's an internal win.
Exactly. It's no less inspiring. At the end of the day, he made a connection with, a woman who runs a pet shop. He proved to himself and to his trainer that he's, he's got what it takes to stand in that arena to fight the best boxer in the world. That's really inspiring, Movies can be about people who are striving for a greater goal. They don't always have to be about winners.
Yeah, exactly. And Rocky is the perfect example of this because, in the end, he proves to himself that he can try. It's what the whole thing is about, and you will often find a movie that Gus rewatched recently, which is kind of a mixed bag, but is still a very interesting film, Dodgeball. I always think about the fact that until the studio made him change it, Ben Stiller's original ending was the Globo Gym Purple Cobras winning.
That would have been a very different movie. Haha, 40 points. But
Yeah.
No, but seriously, I think that would have been interesting because Dodgeball itself, again, I'm not going to defend the film
It's
holistically.
a mixed bag. It's very 2000s.
It is a mixed bag. It is a movie that does kind of live up to its title of being a true underdog story in many ways. And I think it would be even more of an underdog story if they had actually lost.
Yeah, again, because sometimes it is just about going the distance, to borrow Rocky's parlance. And a lot of the time, even if your character fails in the end, if it feels like it makes sense narratively for them to fail, but in that failure, maybe, for example, they still grew, then hell yeah. Another movie that Gus and I have discussed on this channel, Hereditary. Big spoilers for Hereditary, skip 30 seconds into the future, but like none of the main characters of that movie succeed in like defeating the evil going after them, but because they, gave it their best, it makes them not succeeding all the more tragic, which really complements the film's tone and themes.
Because a tragedy it's a type of story that like maybe we don't see as much nowadays in the like era of like the hero's journey is very profitable, but Hereditary is one of these films that like it shows that like even if collapse is inevitable, the idea that these people are like trying to fight against fate makes them compelling, because sometimes that's how life feels. Sometimes it feels inevitable that we're going to lose everything we care about, but if you didn't like put up your dukes in that last moment, really what are you living for?
Exactly, I couldn't agree more. And hey, before we move on to the next point, if you're watching this and wondering, hey, what should I write next? I want to challenge myself. Give a tragedy a go if you've never done one before. You'll discover things about yourself.
And also, I just wanted to say, too, as a companion piece to Dodgeball, I also watched a more recent film called The Paper Tigers, which is
Mm.
about these three guys who were, like, martial arts prodigies in their youth, and they reunite as adults in order to kind of solve the murder mystery of their teacher. That movie's really interesting because, like, it shows that they had the principles of martial arts, the principles of, like, fighting the good fight, of standing up for those who can't fight for themselves, but in their like, older age, in falling out of it, their bodies don't keep up with their own principles. And in relation to this first tip of admiring a character for trying more than their successes, I think is very much the heart of the piece in Paper Tigers.
Yeah, I completely agree. And that's the thing. We have been able to, with a very wide variety of art here, show all the different permutations of how this rule can be successful when you do it well. So yeah, I think that one very much has our rubber stamp.
I mean, that's why you come to us, because we've seen, I don't know, one or two movies in our
Yeah,
day, one or two.
we're out here begging you to watch more movies. I finally bullied Gus into making a letterbox account recently.
Yeah, and hey, I'll tell you one thing. I've been on the Letterboxd. I've been clicking on movies. I've been putting them on lists. It's a whole thing.
Fuck it, go follow the two of us on Letterbox. They'll be on screen now. You can come judge our movie tastes. What's the next rule, Gus?
Rule number 2 in the Pixar rules of storytelling, you gotta keep in mind what's interesting to you as an audience, not what's fun to do as a writer. They can be very different.
Yeah, no, it is true. It is, like, I think this is an important one to have caveats in that, like, you shouldn't be one of those people who is, like, letting what you believe the market wants dictate what you're making, because just the speed it takes to make things will mean that you're often constantly behind the curve. But at the same time, it's dangerous to get into your Gus, can you describe the private nut shack to the people?
Right. So the private nut shack is, everybody knows the like, seminal work of Western animation known as the Nut Shack.
It's the nut shack.
It's the Nut Shack. So obviously this was a short-lived pop culture referencing adult animation with a theme song that's gone viral a couple times. The person behind this, whose name I forget, essentially saw this theme song as a microcosm of the high art that is the Nut Shack. And there's a behind the scenes shot of him just being like singing the theme song as if it's some kind of epic poetry of like, it's the Nut Shack. It's the Nut Shack, and then it builds. It's the Nut Shack. It's a rhapsody of our very soul. And like, the concept of the private nut shack is applying the state of mind that man was in when he said this to any artist who is so fully within their own author appeal that they can't recognize that it is kind of solipsistic what they're doing.
Exactly. You need to get out of your own head, which is why when you have a good draft, it's so vital to show people whose opinions you respect, because they can help break you out of the shit. I know we've both been there, guys. We've been working on something and we've showed it to people, and they've helped kind of like, oxygenate the environment in which we were making a thing.
I mean, talented peers are kind of like omni-important to the process of improving as a writer. Like, even if that's just in like a workshop setting or like a college course setting,
Or even if you're on like r/writing on Reddit or something.
I think it's a two-part thing. I think one part of it is to be in an area of people you can trust whose like writing you believe has merits, and number two, not reflexively dismissing the merits and abilities of other people. And you would think that would be like contradictory, or that like one needs to follow before the other can, but both of these things can be true. You do have to just open yourself up to the possibility that you're a hack and can get better.
Yeah, exactly. Being a hack is not an incurable disease. It's something that happens on a case-by-case basis. We've all been guilty of hackery at one point or another. It comes part and parcel with the work. But it's just really important to basically... I'll put it this way. I think the best way, and the most practical rule you can apply, even alone, to help you better fit this Pixar rule, is just to, when you write something, consider, how do I want the audience to react to this bit I'm writing, and why do I think this will get that reaction?
So, rule number 3 is trying for theme is important, but you won't see what the story is actually until you're about at the end. Now rewrite.
Yeah, no, I think a lot of people overthink theme. The reality is, theme will always be just a reflection of something that you fundamentally believe, because your fundamental beliefs will end up shaping the way characters think and act during a story. I think what this rule is getting at is that having these characters follow those principles that are inherent to you will naturally end in the story meaning something, as long as you wrote honestly.
Yeah, that's the thing. I think it's fine to have ideas going into something, but whether or not a story means anything is an emergent property of the finished product.
Or to put it simply, first draft, you find the theme. Second, and all the drafts after that, you simply clarify the theme, now that you have a better idea of what it is.
I fully agree. I think the most crucial part of this tip is the 2 words at the end, which is the now rewrite.
I've been working on a project that I don't want to talk about at the moment, but I'll put it this way, and Gus can contribute. Gus can confirm, because I've shown him like multiple drafts of this throughout. There have been so many redrafts, some big total rewrites, some just like little consistent additions, removals, modifications. Because at the end of the day, if you finish your first draft and think you're done, you're simply wrong. Leave it to sit for a while, write other things, consume other media, ruminate on it. You will find ways to make it better. That is simply a fact.
And if that sounds like more busy work after the fact, hey, that's what it all is. But it's worth it because you just create a better product by going back in there and writing it again.
I don't know about you, man, but genuinely, I find edits and rewrites to be one of the most fun parts of the job, because you're taking something that already exists, and with each little tweak, if you're doing it right, it's like, wow, this tiny thing I did visibly made the whole thing better. That's awesome. Where are there other parts in this that I can do that?
And in a more selfish way, it's also oh no, I have to think about these characters more and make them better versions of themselves that more convey what I was going for with them and the narrative they inhabit. Oh no, what a chore.
I'll put it this way, it's like your first draft, you get up in the morning, you're feeling like kind of a slob, right? You're like, oh fuck, my hair's all fucked up. I feel like sweaty and greasy because it's way too hot outside. That's your first draft. Then you have some breakfast. Already you're feeling a little bit better. Then you have a walk. You wash your hair. You stick some nice clothes on. You start to get things done. Each of these things, each little bit sort of increases the percentage where you feel like, I've done good today. I don't know about you, I often don't feel like a day is complete until I've had a walk, weather permitting, or I will feel so much fucking better any day I've washed my hair. So, why would you let your manuscript, script, animation, comic, song, poem, whatever, go out there with fucking greasy ass hair?
Take better care of it. Value it the way that you would value you.
And value yourself more, damn it.
Number 4, once upon a time there was blank. Every day, blank. One day, blank. Because of that, blank. And because of that, blank. Until finally, blank.
Yeah. Yeah, basically. It's you introduce a status quo with a character who generally, sorry Goku fans, needs to change. Then an inciting incident happens, which sets them on a motion to the plot, and things change. There is basically pretty much every plot of something that isn't just complete abstract storytelling will follow this. Like, let's take a film that basically everybody loves, The Big Lebowski. So, part one day there's this guy called the Dude. He's a lazy slob who just bowls and drinks White Russians until one day he has his identity mistaken for another guy with the same last name as his, who owes a lot of money to some kind of dodgy people. This ends up getting him involved with that person, which leads him on a series of escalating hijinkses where he meets other people until, in the end, he realizes that the whole thing was kind of bullshit and goes bowling.
Yeah, exactly. And it's very compelling because it establishes the status quo, and by providing that baseline, the extraordinary events that happen to the character that pull him out of that have a real weight and importance. They feel like a deviation from something we've come to find familiar.
Exactly, because if your story ends the same way it starts and is the same throughout the middle, you've just told a bad story.
Yeah, nothing has occurred. I'll take this to like Disney Pixar's first entry, in fact, Toy Story. Every day, Woody and the other toys like do their whole routine of like, being there for Andy. Woody is like the de facto leader until Buzz arrives. And Woody's jealousy causes him to try to sabotage Buzz, which ultimately leads to them becoming stranded and ending up at the neighbor's house. But then, in reconciling that, they end up back at Andy's house through working together.
Yeah, and have both developed as people and realize that it doesn't have to be, to borrow an old cowboy maxim, a town only big enough for one of them.
Exactly. God, the first two Toy Story movies are excellent.
They really are. I've honestly never liked the third one just because I thought, in my own humble opinion, as someone who watched the first two a fucking bajillion times growing up, I think the third one was Pixar taking their reputation for films that make people cry and almost parodying it with the extent of kind of bald-faced emotional manipulation in that movie.
I would agree that essentially Toy Story 3 is, oh, well, you grew up with the first two films. You're doing the exact same thing that Andy is going through right now. Therefore, you should believe that this film is happening to you.
I'm not gonna lie, I don't think I was ever so unhealthily attached to my toys that when I was going to fucking college, I had an emotional scene of handing them over to like my little brother because he was too busy playing Fortnite.
Here's the thing, I do have to clarify. I'm a couple years older than you. The year Toy Story 3 came out was the exact year of my freshman year of college. So, like, the people I talked to at that time, so many of them were like, oh my god, I'm Andy.
And it's like, dude, you were playing with your fucking toy cowboy
What
up
a
until you were like
nerd!
19?
What a nerd!
Holy
Yeah,
shit.
exactly.
I was too busy watching pornography.
I was too busy skateboarding down to the juice bar and meeting some fly honeys to go watch a movie at the Nickelodeon.
Can I borrow, before we move on to Rule 5, just, this is a make staple normally, but just a Henry Law drop that I'm not sure I've ever told you this before.
Oh, go on.
This was before I went to college, I think late high school. My cousin, for my birthday, I think it was my 18th birthday, she got me a big old bottle of New Amsterdam vodka. The thing is, I've never been much of a drinker, but I had it there, I thought, oh, this is a nice bottle, this is nice and classy, but like, I've never been much of a party guy. So there were just so many fucking evenings where I'd just be like watching TV, like just at home, that I would just fucking make myself screwdrivers Just like get cups of orange juice and just spike it with this bottle of New Amsterdam vodka and just sit there drinking it on like just weekday evenings. And just in hindsight, I'm like, that's so fucked up. I shouldn't have done that.
That's so funny. I don't know how it relates to anything we've been talking about.
We're just thinking, like, we're just thinking this was the time that Andy was still like playing with Woody and Buzz.
Right, okay, yeah,
And then
yeah,
there's
like
me
what?
thinking, well, I don't want to waste this bottle. I'm having my evening screwdrivers for like no occasion.
That's fantastic.
Not healthy. Don't do that at home.
No, no, don't do that. Don't follow Chuck Wendig's advice. Follow our advice and do things in moderation. Whatever is healthy for you.
Yeah, you don't want to repeat of the screwdriver years. What's the next rule?
The screwdriver years. Oh my god. Number 5. Simplify. Focus. Combine characters. Hop over detours. You'll feel like you're losing valuable stuff, but it sets you free.
Just thinking of that like parody of the Marine Corps thing. It's like, simplify, do I die? That stupidness aside, yeah, that's again a very good rule.
You know what I like about these so far is that they're so thoroughly about process and not about like the way an audience member would perceive a certain trope or a certain like structure occurring in something. They're very creator focused rather than like from the outside looking in what makes a good entertaining consumable story.
Yeah, because they make the stories. It's not like the like Lily Orchards of the world where she hasn't a fucking clue, so makes some of her writing rules things like you'd actually have to be pretty buff to be an archer. Like that's useful to fucking anyone.
No, yeah, precisely. Like Lily Orchard's writing tips, which this all began from, her tips were like consumer preferences, whereas this is about how to create and engineer these stories.
Yeah, exactly, because that's the thing. Like, Lily Orchard and people like her will only tell you how to make stories they like. Great advice like this, and the advice of Brian Koppelman that part of me really wants to cover someday, but another thing is I just don't think we'd have anything to add. They are advice that, regardless of the type of story you're telling, even if they're stories that, like me and Gus, for example, would have no interest in reading, just because it's not to our personal tastes, these rules will help you make them better. Like, doesn't matter the genre or the tone or the idea.
And like related is the constant comments that I read on the like original Lily Orchard writing tips video where people say like, well, Lily's saying she likes this is wrong because I don't like this. And it's like, we're talking about nothing. Fundamentally, that conversation is utterly distinct from whether or not you're assembling a story.
Exactly. And to sort of boomerang around to the original rule, absolutely condense and simplify, because at the end of the day, fucking one really nuanced character is gonna stick so much more in people's minds than three very thinly developed characters.
Again, the tip itself says it, like, you'll feel like you're losing something valuable because you're attached to these concepts being like multiple characters, but it will set you free. And I believe in that wholeheartedly. A smaller cast of more nuanced characters, even if it ends up being large, is still better for like you like thinking about how these like personalities can be combined to be like more nuanced.
Absolutely. And the thing is, once that initial attachment wears off, you'll be like, it's hard to imagine I ever thought it would work the other way.
Yeah, exactly. Number 6. What is your character good at, comfortable with? Throw the polar opposite at them. Challenge them. How do they deal?
That is completely true. And I have an example of this from my own body of work. If you go to my website, henrygalley.com, you, on the sample pages, you can see sample scripts. One of them is a pilot I wrote called General Manager Murderclaw, which is about a, like, big, tough, like, humanoid dragon warrior lady called General Murderclaw, getting frozen underground and transported into the modern day, where she ends up managing a shitty burger restaurant in London. And that's a great example of the comedy and intrigue you can mine from having a character who is at the absolute top of their game at one thing and having them start at the bottom on another.
No, and having read Murder Claw, it's absolutely worth the read, and it's very funny and very entertaining. And I think one of the aspects of it that really makes it work is the idea that Murder Claw's sort of like charisma and bravado is a transferable skill. It requires a little bit of finesse on her part, but like it's something that helps her in her new life.
Yeah, exactly. Fuck it. I think I'll save people the click and I'll get you a link to put in the comments. But another thing that is not something that either of us wrote that is a great example of this, one of the most popular anime in the world, Mob Psycho 100.
Yeah, with Mob being this essentially a psychic prodigy, but he wants to improve himself in other ways, so he joins up with the Body Improvement Club in order to like kind of like put himself to the test and challenge himself.
Yeah, he's like the best psychic in the world, but what he wants is to just be a cool, sociable kid that people like at school. And that's a real challenge for him.
Exactly. And okay, so I will offer kind of a not a direct counterpoint. I'm not refuting the principle of the rule because I think it can apply to a lot of things. However, in the realm of tabletop RPGs, there is this idea that like your players are picking their roles, their niches, their skill sets so that you'll challenge those skill sets in particular, and like they'll have to like live up to the challenge of are they good enough at the thing they're kind of good at to overcome the challenge. And so if you just always be like, well, none of you are good at this, so that's what the challenge is going to be, you end up creating a situation that's kind of inherently unfair and devalues their choices as characters. And I'm not saying that this is a one-to-one transfer between mediums, but what I am saying is that if you create a character who has a particular skill set and you tell a story that never addresses that skill set and nothing about their original skill set is transferable to the new one they need to succeed, then you might end up with a story where like the character themselves is almost alienated from the premise of what the show actually is.
Yeah, that's the thing, and I think harkens back to what you were saying about Murder Claw, of like, there needs to be some element, if even the mentality, that transfers. And as well, it's a really important thing when trying to write these stories yourself is, for maximum results, it can't be something that is just completely random, likely different to what they're good at. Like, it has to be something that in some ways is diametrically opposite. A great example being the one episode of SpongeBob where Man Ray has to like fake being nice to get the tickle belt taken off, where it's very relevant that his old skill was being evil, because now he's got to learn to literally be the opposite. Not just like, oh, Man Ray, you were an evil supervillain before, but let's see how good you are at running marathons. Like, that just feels arbitrary.
Exactly. There's got to be something inherent to the character that makes the challenge they're presented with relevant. A good example of this is Rango. The main character of that is kind of like this like actor who like ends up like lying his way into being the hero of this town, but he believes in that role so much that eventually he becomes someone who could be respected as a hero. And it's only because he's actually that committed to be wanting to be perceived that way that he like decides that it's actually important to walk the walk, to sacrifice to develop those skills.
And a movie that does it very similarly, Tropic Thunder. And I think of that great line near the end where it's like, we can't beat them, they're trained soldiers. Yeah, well, we're trained actors, motherfucker.
Exactly. So, like, I guess, like, at the end of the day, this tip kind of holds, but also, like, give your characters challenges that are suitable for where they need to be by the end of the story.
Yeah, I don't think anyone could agree with that. All right, what's next?
Number 7. Come up with your ending before you figure out your middle. Seriously, endings are hard. Get yours working up front.
Lots of caveats for this one, and 3 words. 3 words. Game of Thrones.
Yeah, I understand, but also like that's maybe advice that like should have been taken
No,
in
because
Game
here's
of
the thing.
Thrones.
Here's the thing.
Uh-huh.
Figure out your ending. They did that. They knew the ending from very early on. Their mistake was not modifying it as characters developed in unexpected ways as things went along. Their issue was being like, definitely have an idea of your ending, but do not be inflexible with it. Because you will end up with your characters and plots changing, and then you needing to force them back into a box that they don't fit in. Which is why the Game of Thrones ending was terrible. So many characters had to either take complete, like, just very random changes or, like, complete U turns with their characterization to make the ending work.
You're right. When it comes to attempting to tell, especially an epic story, something on that scale, you should have a point B from your point A, because otherwise, point A is just going to be a long string of incidents that don't really have a purpose.
Yeah, and if you do find you're having trouble with an ending and you haven't planned it, I'll always remember the Stephen King advice that he gave in regards to The Stand, which I think George R. R. Martin very much could take. When in doubt, just blow up half your characters.
It has to be something where the trajectory is readable. You can change that any number of times in between the story, but for you yourself personally, have some trajectory.
Yeah, it's got to make sense when traced back, when all is said and done, no matter how windy it is on the way there.
Well, we've talked about a few different horror films that create scares early on that don't work post climax. And I think that kind of thing is an example of like, well, yeah, sure, it reached some kind of ending, but it's an ending that doesn't follow from the initial. If your ending, like, actively makes earlier parts of the narrative irrelevant, then that's a bad ending. You should have planned it better.
Yep, as we always say, never make any part of your story feel arbitrary.
Exactly. And especially because, as the tip says, endings are hard, and they really, really are.
They really are. It's true. All right, next tip.
Number 8, finish your story. Let go, even if it's not perfect. In an ideal world, you have both, but move on. Do better next time.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. There is, as much as we talked about the importance of redrafting earlier, there is a point when it simply becomes perverse. Um, I think a great example, and we'll link to yours and Meg's video about it, but to beat a very popular dead horse growing around.
Yeah, exactly. That's a good example of just prolonging the creative buildup towards your story being itself.
Exactly. And at a certain point, we were talking before this call about how much we admire Fujimoto, Chainsaw Man's writer, because he's made so many different things in his life rather than just doing the typical manga thing and having just one 1,000 chapter project under his belt. Like, you're fundamentally going to be a better writer if you cross train.
Exactly. And that's the thing. I remember being in the early like 20 teens and being like, "Oh, well, Bleach or Naruto, they're going to end sometime soon. So we really can't judge the work holistically until they end." And it's one of those things where like, yeah, it's true that you can't judge the work like totally until it ends, but like you want that moment when the story is finished for it to all just be for it to all just make sense, you
Yeah.
know? Again, it's kind of like self-indulgent at
Yeah,
that
you're
point.
just wasting your time. You've got to chalk it up to experience, move on, and like they say, do better next time. You will be a better writer for having done and finished multiple things than just endlessly grinding away on one thing. Because trust me, if you do that, when your thing does end, you will be at a horrific loss. And I think that's why so many of these big projects don't end. There is the terror of, well, what's next?
Well, this happens in Hollywood too, because it's like nobody makes a masterpiece on the first try. And if somehow you make something regarded as a masterpiece on the first try, you're going to have the rest of your life as a creator being like pursued by people who want you to recreate that initial masterpiece that in your mind and in truth is most likely not a masterpiece.
Literal perfect example of that. Me, Gus, and Meg all love the movie Clerks, but I saw, just recommended to me the other day on YouTube, a trailer for Clerks 3 and thought, the fact that this is going to exist is one of the most depressing things I've ever seen.
Yeah, now here's the thing. I'm one of the people who like is okay with the He-Man's Masters of the Universe like Kevin Smith like Netflix show. I think it's fine. I think it's okay for Masters of the Universe. It's better than that kind of like dead niche franchise has any right to be. And anyone who remembers the Dolph Lundgren like leading man film will know what I mean. But at the same time, Kevin Smith he's been pigeonholed because Clerks was such a flash in the pan, perfect conceptualization of that 90s angst.
Yeah, and he's responsible for that pigeonholing as much as anyone else. Because, as people will often say about Kevin Smith, he does have a bit of a problem with, like, like with his podcast and stuff, he creates a bit of a cult of personality that just loves his very, like, idiosyncratic style. Because that's the thing, he hasn't made a movie as good as Clerks since Clerks, is the rather depressing thing.
Yeah, no, and here's the thing. I understand that being the prevailing opinion. I have difficulty assigning blame to the creator because it almost feels like in a lot of these cases it is the social pressures surrounding the person that pushes them towards being the person who made the masterpiece and coasting by on that. Like, we don't live in a vacuum where, like, we know what Kevin Smith would do if there was, like, no pressure on him to be the guy that made Clerks. And so, yes, this is how it's played out. Maybe he'll create something better this day, like, past this point. But ultimately, I can't assign blame to him because it's the zeitgeist surrounding him being the guy who made Clerks that has led to his career being in such a place.
It's true, and it will remain, I think, an interesting conversation around the nature of auteurism for the rest of the future of film critical theory.
Exactly. And hey, before we do, Movie Bob's gonna have something to say on it.
Fucking next rule.
Number 9. When you're stuck, make a list of what you wouldn't want to happen next. Lots of times, the material to get you unstuck will show up.
Yep, no, that's really useful. Honestly, I just find that sometimes if I'm working through an idea, just grabbing a notebook and just like writing out my thoughts on it just makes stuff happen.
Yeah, well, we have this like time-honored tradition between the two of us and our extended writing group of writing the stupid version first. And that doesn't always mean writing it down, but what it does mean is that, like, if you're struggling with what is going to occur in the plot next, think of the dumbest possible development that would fully break the movie, and then just don't do that. Do anything else but that, and it will be better. And hey, you'll be a few pages further.
It's a time-honored tradition with us to the extent that we even have this very particular voice that we refer to as the macaque voice.
Yeah, buddy.
That comes along with the stupid version of the movie. Like, that's the voice that, like, the
Wouldn't it be ridiculous if the characters started behaving like this?
Yeah, no, exactly. And it can just be just a really fun creative exercise. Like, the perfect example being the other day, we were talking about these people like arguing about fracking in a creative context, and the person saying, "Yeah, we want to like mine the area for natural gas." We said, "Imagine if one of the other characters in the scene was like, oh yeah, how's this for natural gas?" and then just did an unnaturally long fart and died.
like a something out of like a parody movie from the early 2000s of
A
just
movie
overly long fart gag where he's like
that just
moaning.
deflates them like a balloon
Yeah,
into death.
just falls over and dies. And it's like, yeah,
And that is the stupid version.
exactly. That would be the worst thing to occur, so just write something different. The first thing that comes to mind that isn't that.
Exactly. And then you can redraft later. What's the next rule?
Number 10, pull apart the stories you like. What you like in them is part of you. You've got to recognize it before you can use it.
I was watching a great masterclass course by the Duffer Brothers the other day, and a piece of advice they gave connect to this is take some time to look at all of the things you love, like movies, games, all these different things, and ask yourself, what are the commonalities? What are the connective tissue that brings you to these things and makes them resonate with you? And trying to reflect that in your own work will be the truest version of your taste.
Yeah, and it's funny that you bring up the Duffer Brothers because I'm not the biggest Stranger Things fan in the world. I kind of dropped off after season 2. However, I will say this, of what I've seen of their show, the Duffer Brothers do have this way of, in some ways, their show is derivative of a lot of other things, but they've stolen so much so thoroughly and then from that point transformed it in such a way that the final product is holistically something that has the appeal of all these sources but is distinct while still being familiar.
Yeah, exactly, and it's that same attitude that's often like given to people like Tarantino in his like heyday of good movies, where
Tarantino's alleged heyday of alleged good movies.
I mean, he did have some movies that are unquestionably like stylistically these like formative classics. Things like, for example, Pulp Fiction and Kill Bill Volume 1. You
Yeah.
know, things that and Reservoir Dogs. These things that didn't come from a place of everyone was already telling him he was the coolest, smartest dude in the world.
There's certainly Tarantino films. No. Here's the thing. I will say that the merits of those films are self-evident in the films themselves, in the individual texts. But like, again, like we were saying with Kevin Smith earlier, it's one of those things where like sometimes a person just becomes the meme version of themselves rather than like evolving.
Oh, 100%. Honestly, I hate much more Tarantino movies than I like, and I think as a person, he's kind of a piece of shit. And I find the way he writes dialogue, again, in any movies that aren't Reservoir Dogs, Pulp Fiction, and Kill Bill Volume 1, to be stupendously obnoxious. But those are all films that borrow extremely heavily from other things. I mean, Reservoir Dogs is basically a straight up remake of a Chinese film called Infernal Affairs. You can only get away from with stealing if you're very well read. If you're someone who does have an incredibly narrow pool of like things you like, of sources to steal from, then your influence will. Because I always think of this. There is such a interesting fine line between like, oh my god, this person traced these other things, to, oh, holy shit, this is such an incredible compositional homage.
Exactly. There's a fundamental difference between Stranger Things and Ready Player One.
Exactly. It's, I think on this channel we have often used the metaphor of the cake, of like, you should never bite into a slice of cake and taste flour and eggs.
Yeah. It's got to be completely made before it becomes a real cake.
Its own thing, exactly. You get all the bits you want, but for the love of God, cook them.
Number 11. Putting it on paper lets you start fixing it. If it stays in your head, a perfect idea, you'll never share it with anyone.
110%. We've always said this. Write it. Just write it.
This might be like the most recurring tip that we've ever given on this channel. I don't know if we have anything else to say about that, but like, start writing like it's better on paper than it is in your head.
You want to call yourself a writer? Fucking write.
Hell
Don't
yeah.
be one of those sad buggers who spends their whole life figuring out how a world ender can exist in the
In
same
the same
universe as a
Planet Eater and
celestial
a
god or
Clan of
whatever the fuck it
Wizards.
was.
Oh my god.
Also, if you make a soil map and your story isn't about like farming, we will personally come to your house and explain our passions to
We
you.
will personally come to your house and not consume any of your art.
We'll cut your nuts off. We'll fuck with your
We'll fuck with
nuts.
your nuts. You think we won't cut you?
Fucking
Number
love that.
12. This is another ode to the stupid version. It's discount the first thing that comes to mind, and the second, third, fourth, fifth. Get the obvious out of the way. Surprise yourself.
I agree. Don't want to dwell on this. The only thing I'll say is it's similar to David Lynch's iconic advice of like, we're going for the big fish here. The first few little ones you have, throw them out, go deeper.
Exactly. A plot that comes from like your very first ideas is probably not going to be as compelling as one that you like thought deeply about, with several different iterations in the way.
Exactly.
Number 13. Give your characters opinions. Passive slash malleable might seem likable to you as you write, but it's poison to the audience. 110% agree with this one.
Yeah, exactly. Like even if your character, like what your characters believe is wrong, they should believe something.
I love characters with convictions and like beliefs all their own. Like doormat characters or everyman characters that don't really have any like core principles are like so boring to me, especially when they're the protagonist. Like it can make a story where there are other interesting ancillary characters worse for having a bad core.
Yeah, exactly. It's one of those things where like we call this out in media all the time. Ones where you can tell the writer just liked either their side characters or their villain better. And it's like, that's not the sign that you've written just brilliant side characters and villain. It's a sign that you've written a bad protagonist.
Exactly. Like this is the whole thing of like people being like, Mabel shouldn't, commit to certain actions because it makes things difficult for other people. And it's like, no, that conflict like adds tension to the finale. It gives context to Bill Cipher even showing up at all because let's face it, we did a whole video about why this is the case. Bill Cipher doesn't function or work without the other characters being selfish.
Yeah, it's true, which is, again, I want this to go on the screen. I'll send it to you. Alex Hirsch is the best person of this, of just, like, talking down people who have this mentality, saying, like, oh, the reason some people crush on Bill Cipher is because teenagers are so confused and hormonal. Anything that seems confident and non-threatening, they'll want to fuck, even if it's a triangle.
Yeah, exactly. And I will give like a shout out to two examples of characters who are passive and malleable, but like is actually utilized well in the story. In one example that is less embarrassing to admit that you like, I guess marginally, I don't know, depending on the like audience of this channel, is Huey from The Boys. He's a guy who begins the story in a very victimized place. He's someone who is to be acted upon by the rest of the world, and only by teaming up with the rest of the boys does he end up being someone who pursues what he wants. And him going down that path is not a descent into darkness, it's a descent into searching for justice in a world that doesn't have it inherent.
And crucially, he has decided this before the end of the pilot. I think of very specifically the moment in the first episode of The Boys where he agrees to accept the payout and the apology with A-Train so he can go into the Vought Tower and implant the bug for Billy Butcher. And then afterwards, when he's talking to Billy, he says, hey, have you ever seen that guy tear up $20,000 before? And he tears up the check Vought gave him. So even before Translucent then attacks and he and Billy fight him off and he becomes like an official member of the boys, already the tragedy that has happened to him has, despite him being an everyman, given him a conviction. And that conviction is revenge and justice for Robin, who was killed by A-Train.
Exactly. And that's what makes him a great character. It's like there's like a conflict between whether he'll commit actions or like, default to inaction, but we know where he's meant to go. There's a trajectory there. And the other more embarrassing example is the the character of Jerry Smith from Rick and Morty, who
Oof.
is generally a pretty passive, pretty underwhelming, like, character who fails a lot, but in some ways, he ends up being a foil to Rick because even at Jerry's worst, he's kind of an arrogant fuck up who ultimately aims for like some connection with the people around him. Whereas Rick Sanchez can close himself off and commit complete atrocities and become completely utterly inhuman. And the contrast between the two shows that like, okay, well, even the worst average sheep of a person that Rick Sanchez disdains, he can't say that he's inherently better than that person because in his arrogant god complex, he does infinite more harm than to the world than just someone who's a perpetual loser.
It's true, and again, crucially, Jerry is not the main character of the show.
And again, crucially, it's embarrassing to like Rick and Morty.
It is. You should be ashamed if you do.
I am. Number 14. Why must you tell this story? What's the belief burning within you that your story feeds off of? That's the heart of it.
See, this is a great rule because if this was heated, men wouldn't have happened.
Oh my god, yeah. Because Alex Garland...
Why the fuck was Alex Garland the person to tell that story?
Yeah, like what was the burning belief inside of him? Was the burning belief inside of him that he really wanted to work with Rory Kinnear 7 times?
Yeah. No, exactly. Like, I'll put it this way: if you, for example, think that you have a story that is about like racism and the streets, it better be something that you've experienced. Otherwise, you're just gonna feel like a misery tourist who is like capitalizing other people's pain for fame, success, and butt pats.
Yeah, I also think there's an element of recognizing your own self in this and being introspective about why you make certain decisions. Because if there's something that you're so passionate about that you like need to make a story that has like these specific things happen in it, that says something about you as a person and why you chose this. And you can try to deny it and you can try to say that it's like, just some thought experiment, but it really is a piece of you. And maybe you don't end up even writing that story once you realize the essential piece that you could tell a better story from. But if you've set out to do something creative, you are in some way bearing your soul. And to frame it in any other way other than that, and to put up walls like around the real reason you're like involved in this in the first place, it's only ever going to diminish the final impact of what your art could be.
Exactly. Know thyself. Be self-aware. What's the next rule?
Number 15. If you were your character in this situation, how would you feel? Honesty lends credibility to unbelievable situations.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We were discussing this the other day, Gus, weren't we? Of like, at the end of the day, your character, unless it's an autobiographical thing, shouldn't be you in a literal sense. You should abstract your character from yourself, but their struggles should be, like we were just saying, honest to your experience.
Exactly. And this also, it prevents you from doing, this is something that a character at this point in the story should do because I've seen them do it in other things, and or this is the logical thing that a person acting under pure logic would do. If you can ground yourself in the character as a person, as a human being, then you can create what is right for your story, not something that's merely an imitation or just a rote procession of the optimal course of action.
Exactly. You should never be writing Abed's sensible horror movie. The point of that joke is that would be a terrible story. I'm sorry to people who disagree. You are simply wrong.
Exactly.
Next rule.
Number 16. What are the stakes? Give us a reason to root for the character. What happens if they don't succeed? Stack the odds against.
I'll put it this way, the simplest metaphor. No one walking a tightrope a foot off the ground has ever drawn a crowd.
Yeah, no, that's entirely true. You need to have some reason for, this plot to, if something goes wrong for the character, there will be a significant change in the status quo that was established at the beginning of the movie. Not that
Yeah,
they just go back to it.
and this doesn't need to mean that the universe or the world or God for fucking bid, the multiverse, is under threat. It can mean as much as this person loses their job, a relationship they have will break down. It might just be something that will like threaten their life or just make them feel shitty. It depends on the scale of the story you're telling.
Exactly, because like if it's all relative, then there's no reason to root for the character.
There was this great piece of advice in a screenwriting book I was reading the other day. That is just like it was. I forgot who it was quoting, but it was so and so's rule of drama, which was, and everything was hunky dory, and then it wasn't.
Yeah, exactly. you
That is exactly what your story structure should be. Like, give your characters small wins as they complete challenges, and then yank it away from them and have a bigger challenge.
exactly. Things gotta go kind of very wrong before they can go good again.
Exactly. The night is darkest just before the dawn. Next rule.
So this is one that we're very familiar with. No work is ever wasted. If it's not working, let it go and move on. It'll come back around to be useful later.
Yep. Nothing we could say here is better than the bread metaphor that we covered in that one Tumblr writing advice episode.
No, it's very true. I think about that
go
all
and
the
watch
time.
Tumblr writing advice part 1 for that great bread metaphor. Even if you watched it before, rewatch it. It's one of our best two professional writers, honestly.
Exactly. And the thing is, I always think about like this concept in relation to how good that metaphor was and how Chuck Wendig turned this into, is your baby not living? Butcher it for spare parts. Chuck Wendig's like infanticide metaphor for like, yes, I will make a better thing out of parts of a baby, a dead baby.
What a weird, repulsive dude. Next rule.
Number 18, you have to know yourself. The difference between doing your best and fussing. Story is testing, not refining.
This is an interestingly ambiguous rule. What's your take on this, Gus?
Yeah, because I agree with you have to know yourself, and I agree with like you should do your best, and if fussing is like kind of like just putting a bunch of stuff together that doesn't mean anything to you, I agree with that. Testing, not refining, is weird because I think it's both. Like you test yourself and test your range and test like whether or not the concept is correct, but then after you've done doing that, you refine it. Correct?
Yeah. Yeah, testing is drafting, refining is redrafting. I think this in its case is like it's a bunch of like components that all seem decent on their own for the most part, but really do not a cohesive rule make.
Yeah, I think what this might be saying is something that you said earlier. This is my charitable interpretation of this, is that, like, create the concept with the intention that it will be the best version of itself. To continue to pick at it and to edit and to try and, like, iterate on it endlessly is just a chore. Once it's achieved some version of itself, you have to expose it to air, expose it to people, like, and in some way that tunes back to you knowing yourself. Is this something that you could be proud of saying, this came from me? But again, it's a little incoherent.
Yeah, I think we'll move on from this one because I think we would only be reiterating other points we've made to try and take this like clause by clause.
There's 22 of these. They can't all be winners.
Yeah, exactly.
Number 19. Coincidences to get characters into trouble are great. Coincidences to get them out of it are cheating.
Yeah, no, that's true. That's true. I think the one exception is if you're writing a comedy and it's really funny for a coincidence to get them out of trouble.
Yeah, sometimes a like well-timed anticlimax can be very funny. And at the end of the day, if it's the punchline of like a very, very well set up joke, then that can be worth it.
Yeah, that is the one situation in which this rule is void, but that I think is the classic exception that proves the rule. And again, the reason that is funny is because it's not what you are supposed to do, and thus is unexpected.
Exactly. The corollary to this also is that, like, not all the reasons why characters get into trouble should be utterly coincidental, because that leads to a plot in which the character choices aren't the things that like further their struggles. It ends up being the universe acting against them.
Yeah, it really depends on just the story you're telling, ultimately.
But I think as a rule, I do think that this is a good way to be about things.
Yeah, no, I agree.
Number 20, exercise. Take the building blocks of a movie you dislike. How do you rearrange them into what you do like?
I do agree that you should exercise. This one feels so out of place with the rest of them.
I will say that this rule is something that I find very tempting, but that's because I believe in this rule to a fault sometimes when it comes to coming up with new story concepts.
That's the thing. I think sometimes the issue with a thing like this, and it can be really fun, is just that, like, occasionally the spare part that a bad movie needed to be good isn't always in it.
Yes, and I think that, like, there was the earlier tip about, like, taking the parts of the things you like and, like, breaking them apart and seeing why you like them. I think what's better than, like, looking at a movie you dislike and rearranging the elements of that into something you do like is finding the one thing you like about it and wholesale lifting it away from the context that made it bad in that, and then just incorporating it into the other, like, tools in your toolbox of things you do like.
If you see a bad piece of art do one great thing, it is your moral duty to steal it and put it in a good thing. I agree with that wholeheartedly.
But fundamentally steal nothing else. If you are fishing and the fish you pull up has like a bunch of ick on it, but it's a pretty big fish, like throw it away. wait for the real the fuck this metaphor. Number 21. You gotta identify with your situations/characters. Can't just write cool. What would make you act that way? Gotta be honest, I feel like this is tip number 2.
Yeah, this is at that point that we encounter with a lot of these rules where we realize, why did you feel the need to hit this number? Because you're just repeating yourself.
Exactly. Like it's Chuck Wendig's obsession with like the number 25.
Yeah.
Like,
but Gus, it's 1/4. That's so amazeballs.
I don't narwhal bacon care about that, Charles.
Yeah.
I get it, but it is a reiteration of something that we've already heard. So hey, down there in the comments, if you want to hear what we think about this tip, just go back to the beginning of the video and watch what we have to say about it and give us more time.
It's that line from that one episode of Brass Eye when it's like, if you bought this album just because of the controversy around it, I think you should throw it out and then buy another copy just because you like the song.
Yep. Nope. Hard to argue with that. That makes a lot of sense. Hey.
And you should do that with these videos. What's the last tip?
The last tip, and here's the thing, it always seems to be this way, that the last tip is kind of the most banal and the most like, we got to the end to the last tip. And this one, I wouldn't say is much different. Number 22. What's the essence of your story? Most economical telling of it. If you know that, you can build from there.
I think that is just a reiteration of, like, simplify, know your theme. Like, I'm going to be honest, lads, this was an 18 tip list. And there were 18 good tips, but it was an 18 tip list.
And here's the thing about this one. Whenever you encounter writing advice that just boils down to write good, do the story. Yeah!
But at the end of the day, we can't badmouth it that much considering we're here at what I imagine in the final video will be just over an hour rather than almost 8 of them. So I'm not going to rake them over the coals for having a few redundant tips because, hey, some of the things that they had redundant tips about were, like, important enough advice that if you're not people who, like, live and breathe writing advice like us, it's worth reiterating.
Exactly. And this is only, like, redundant or, like, not useful in the context of this list already provided that utility. Like, on its own, asking someone what is the essence of your story, the most economical telling of it, if you know that, you can build from there. That's still a banger of a writing advice. That on its own, if you told someone that, like, they could still get a lot out of that. It just happens to be the 20-second tip of a list that has a lot of bangers prior to it.
Yeah, Pixar have had some misses. They've had some bad films. They've had some just sort of middling films.
The good dinosaur, more like the good dinosaur that isn't very good movie. I don't
You
like it.
got 'em.
Yeah.
But point is, when Pixar is on form, they have unlocked the formula to just reaching into your heart more consistently than almost any other studio. And on that alone, they have earned, our attention for 22 tips.
Exactly, exactly. Because at the end of the day, you've got a friend in me. Some other writers might be better at writing than I am, bigger and stronger too, maybe. But none of them will ever love these 22 tips the way that I do. It's you and me, boy.
I think that's the end.